Earth was given an ultimatum. Humanity answered with fire. The morning sky above New York City turned dark without warning, and millions of people stopped in the streets to look up at something that should not have existed. A ship larger than any mountain on Earth descended through the clouds, blocking out the sun and casting a shadow that stretched across the entire Atlantic Ocean within minutes. Similar shadows fell over Beijing, Moscow, London, and every major city on the planet as smaller vessels took positions in the atmosphere. The world had always wondered if humanity was alone in the universe, and now they had their answer in the most terrifying way possible. Admiral Miriam Okonkwo stood in the command center of the United Nations Emergency Response Facility, watching dozens of screens that showed the same impossible images from every corner of the globe. She had spent 30 years preparing for wars between nations, but nothing in her training had prepared her for this moment. "We are receiving a transmission on every frequency," said a young technician, his voice shaking with fear, "and it is coming through on every device connected to any network on Earth." The main screen flickered, and then a face appeared that would haunt human nightmares for generations to come. Grand Emissary Vethkan stood over 8 feet tall, with a body that resembled a massive insect covered in dark metallic armor. His 4 eyes glowed with a cold blue light, and when he spoke, the translation came through in every language simultaneously. "People of Earth, I am Grand Emissary Vethkan of the Valorian Dominion, and I bring you a message that will determine the fate of your species." He paused, letting his words sink into the hearts of 8 billion terrified humans. "The Dominion has watched your world for many cycles, and we have completed our assessment of your kind. You are classified as a Class 7 predator species, which means you are violent and aggressive and dangerously creative. Your history is a record of endless wars and suffering that you inflict upon yourselves and your own planet. We have seen species like yours before, and we know what happens when you are allowed to spread beyond your world. You consume and destroy everything you touch, and you bring chaos to every system you enter." Admiral Okonkwo felt her hands tighten into fists as she listened to this alien creature judge her entire species. "The Valorian Dominion rules over 3,000 worlds, and we have maintained peace and order for 10,000 years. We cannot allow a threat like humanity to grow unchecked and eventually challenge our stability. Therefore, you are given 2 choices, and you must make your decision within 30 of your planetary rotations." The alien leaned forward, and his eyes seemed to pierce through the screen directly into the souls of everyone watching. "Your first choice is to accept stewardship under the Dominion, which means you will disarm completely and dismantle all of your weapons and military forces and space programs. You will be assigned a governing council that will guide your development along peaceful paths, and you will never leave your planet without permission. Your second choice is to refuse, and if you refuse, we will have no option but to eliminate your species before you become a danger to the galaxy. This is not a negotiation, and there will be no further discussion. You have 30 days to submit your answer." The screen went dark, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted everywhere at once in the emergency facility. Admiral Okonkwo watched as world leaders began arguing through video connections, their fear turning into panic and their panic turning into desperate finger-pointing. President of France demanded immediate surrender, saying that survival under alien rule was better than extinction. The Prime Minister of India shouted that they should fight, even if it meant dying with honor. The Russian president sat in cold silence, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Within hours, protests filled the streets of every city, with some people holding signs begging for peace and others demanding that humanity stand and fight. Families gathered in their homes, holding each other and wondering if they would live to see the next month. Churches and temples and mosques overflowed with people seeking comfort in faith. But in that underground command center, Admiral Okonkwo felt something different rising in her chest. It was not fear. And it was not despair, it was rage. She had been born in Lagos to parents who had survived civil war. And she had grown up hearing stories of how her ancestors had fought against impossible odds. She had dedicated her life to protecting people. And she would not let some alien empire tell her that humanity deserved to die. "Admiral, what do we do?" asked the young technician. Looking at her with desperate hope, Okonkwo turned to face the room full of frightened officers and analysts. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "We do what humans have always done when someone threatens to destroy us. We fight." A general from China shook his head with a bitter laugh, saying that they had no weapons that could touch ships capable of crossing the stars. "Then we build new weapons." Okonkwo replied without hesitation, "We have 30 days. And I have seen what humanity can accomplish when we work together with a deadline. We built the atomic bomb in 3 years while fighting a world war. And we put a man on the moon with computers weaker than a modern phone. Do not tell me what we cannot do." She walked to the center of the room and looked at every face, demanding their attention and their courage. "Contact every government and tell them that the United Earth Council is now in session. We need every scientist and every engineer and every soldier working on one goal. I do not care about borders or politics or old grudges anymore. Those things died the moment that ship appeared in our sky." A voice came through from the video link, belonging to the Secretary General of the United Nations, asking what message they should send to the aliens. Admiral Okonkwo smiled. And it was not a kind smile. "Tell them that we have received their ultimatum. Tell them that we understand their terms perfectly. And tell them this exact phrase, translated into whatever language they speak." She paused, feeling the fire building in her heart. "We do not kneel." The room fell silent. And then slowly, one by one, the people around her began to nod. In that moment, something changed in the heart of humanity. Fear remained, but it was no longer alone now. It stood alongside defiance. And defiance would prove to be the more powerful force. The clock began counting down from 30 days. And humanity started preparing its answer. It would not be written in words of surrender. It would be written in fire. Earth was given an ultimatum. Humanity answered with fire. The first week after the ultimatum was pure chaos. But chaos had always been where humanity did its best work. Admiral Okonkwo stood before the newly formed United Earth Council, looking at faces that had been enemies just days before. American generals sat next to Russian commanders, and Chinese admirals shared tables with their Japanese counterparts. Old hatred still simmered beneath the surface, but the shadow of extinction had a way of making those hatreds seem very small. "We have 23 days remaining," Okonkwo announced, her voice steady and strong. "And we need to accomplish more in those days than we have in the last 100 years of separate development." She gestured to a screen showing the alien vessels, still hovering in orbit, watching and waiting. "Our enemy believes we are primitive and weak, and they expect us to either surrender or die fighting with sticks and stones. They are wrong, and we are going to prove just how wrong they are." In laboratories across the world, scientists began working on projects that had been abandoned or forbidden. Dr. Yuki Tanaka received a phone call at 3 in the morning in her small apartment in Tokyo, and the voice on the other end told her to pack a bag immediately. She had spent 15 years developing theoretical designs for plasma-based weapons, but every government had rejected her work as too dangerous and too expensive. Now, those same governments were begging her to turn theory into reality in less than a month. "This is impossible," she told the military officer who escorted her to a converted subway station that had become her new laboratory. The officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Chun, simply shook her head. "Dr. Tanaka, I have learned something very important in fact. The last week, Nothing is impossible when 8 billion people decide they want to live. Dr. Tanaka looked around at the dozens of engineers and technicians already working. People from 12 different countries speaking in broken English and hand gestures to communicate. She felt something stir in her chest that she had not felt in years. It was hope across the Pacific Ocean. Similar scenes played out in secret facilities, hidden beneath mountains and deserts in cities in Nevada. American and Russian engineers worked together to modify nuclear warheads, creating weapons designed to bypass the energy shields that the Dominion ships used. They argued constantly about methods and designs, sometimes throwing tools at each other in frustration. But they never stopped working. An old Russian engineer named Victor grabbed his American counterpart by the collar after a particularly heated argument, and for a moment it looked like violence would erupt. Then, Victor laughed and pulled the American into a rough hug. "You are a stubborn fool," he said in broken English, "but you are my kind of stubborn fool. Now let us build something that will make these alien bastards regret coming here." In Brazil, factories that had produced cars and appliances retooled overnight to manufacture components for weapons that had not existed a week before. Workers pulled double and triple shifts without complaint, sleeping on the factory floors for a few hours before returning to their stations. A foreman named Carlos watched his employees with tears in his eyes, knowing that some of them had children at home who might never see tomorrow, but they kept working. Because what else could they do? The Dominion watched from orbit with what might have been amusement if their species understood such emotions. Brand Emissary Vethcon received daily reports on human activity, noting the increased communications between nations and the surge in manufacturing. His second-in-command, a younger Valorian named Vexal, suggested that they should be concerned. Vethkin dismissed the worry with a wave of his armored hand. "We have seen this behavior in 17 other species facing extinction," he said with absolute confidence. "They scramble and panic and build their little weapons, and then they die just as easily as if they had done nothing. These humans are no different, and their crude technology cannot threaten us." He did not notice the cargo ships being quietly moved to new locations in orbit. He did not see the thousands of satellites being repositioned in patterns that seemed random but were actually very precise. He did not understand that humanity had spent its entire existence fighting itself, and that generations of warfare had made them masters of deception and surprise. On day 15, Dr. Tanaka successfully tested the first plasma cannon in an underground chamber, and a beam of superheated energy cut through a sheet of alien alloy salvaged from a crashed probe decades earlier. She fell to her knees and wept while her team cheered around her. "It works," she whispered. "It actually works." Lieutenant Chun helped her to her feet with a fierce grin on her face. "How many can we build in 15 days? Dr. Tanaka wiped her eyes and looked at her exhausted team. People who had not seen sunlight or their families in 2 weeks. "Not enough," she admitted, "but we will build as many as humanly possible, and then we will build more." On day 20, Admiral Okonkwo received reports from every sector of the global effort, and what she saw filled her with pride. They had built over 300 plasma cannons of various sizes, along with thousands of modified missiles and kinetic weapon civilian cargo. Ships had been converted into suicide bombers, crewed by volunteers who knew they would not return. Underground bunkers had been stocked with supplies for the survivors. If there were any survivors, old fighter jets had been fitted with new weapons, and pilots who had been retired for years returned to duty without hesitation. A training facility in Australia had become a camp for ground soldiers, teaching them tactics for fighting enemies they had never seen. An old sergeant major from Britain trained them without mercy, pushing them past their limits every single day. "The aliens have better technology," he shouted at his exhausted recruits. "But technology means nothing against a soldier who refuses to die." You will be faster, you will be meaner, and you will be the worst nightmare these invaders have ever faced. On day 25, the United Earth Council gathered to compose their official response to the Dominion ultimatum. Diplomats argued about wording and tone, some wanting to leave room for negotiation, and others demanding pure defiance. Admiral Okonkwo listened to them argue for 2 hours before she stood and silenced the room with a single raised hand. I will write the response myself. She walked to the console and began typing. And when she finished, she broadcast the message on every frequency powerful enough to reach the alien fleet. The message was short. To the Valorian Dominion and Grand Emissary Vethkon, we have received your ultimatum and considered your terms carefully. Our answer is this. We decline your offer of submission. Come and take our fire, if you can hold it. Signed, Admiral Miriam Okonkwo, on behalf of the United Earth Council and all of humanity. Grand Emissary Vethkan read the message in his command chamber and felt something he had not experienced in centuries. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling as surprise. They actually refuse. He said to Vexal, a strange note in his voice. As you predicted they would. His second replied. Thukum nodded slowly, his 4 eyes narrowing. Summon the punitive fleet. It seems we must teach these creatures the price of defiance. He did not know that the price would be far higher than he ever imagined on Earth. Humanity waited with weapons in their hands and fire in their hearts. The countdown reached day 30, and the sky began to fill with enemy ships. The first battle for Earth was about to begin. Earth was given an ultimatum. Humanity answered with fire. The Dominion punitive fleet descended on Earth with the confidence of predators. Approaching helpless prey, 200 warships moved into attack formation, their weapons charging with energy that could level entire cities in seconds. Grand Emissary Vethkon watched from the bridge of his flagship. Expecting the battle to last no more than 6 hours, his tactical officers predicted total pacification of the planet with minimal Dominion casualties. Because this was how it always happened when primitive species tried to resist. But humanity had never been a species that did what was expected. Admiral Okonkwo stood in her command bunker deep beneath the Swiss Alps, surrounded by screens showing every angle of the approaching fleet. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands were steady and her voice was calm. All stations report status. The responses came in from around the world, from the plasma cannon installations and the missile batteries and the thousands of satellites waiting in orbit. Tokyo battery ready. Moscow defense grid online. Orbital assets in position. Cargo fleet standing by. Okonkwo closed her eyes for just a moment, thinking of her daughter who was hiding in a bunker somewhere in Kenya. Then she opened her eyes and spoke the words that would change history. Operation Prometheus is a go. Light them up. The first Valorian cruiser exploded without warning, torn apart by a cloud of tungsten projectiles moving at 20 kilometers per second. The satellites that humanity had been repositioning for weeks had not been random at all. They were weapons. Simple metal spheres packed with tungsten rods and aimed at precise coordinates. When they detonated in sequence, they created a wall of shrapnel that shredded the Dominion fighter formations like paper. And a Hurricane Viking lurched forward in his command chair as alarms screamed throughout his ship. What is happening? He demanded. Watching icons vanish from his tactical display, his officers scrambled to understand, their confidence shattering as more ships reported damage. The debris field has been weaponized, one shouted. They turned their own orbital junk into a minefield. Before Vethkon could respond, the second wave hit. Nuclear warheads erupted against the shields of his capital ships, weapons so crude and brutal that the Dominion had not used them in millennia. The shields held against the first impacts, but the humans had done something unexpected. To the warheads, they had modified them to release electromagnetic pulses, tuned to frequencies that disrupted. Valorian technology shields flickered and failed across the fleet, leaving ships vulnerable for precious seconds. In those seconds, The plasma cannons on Earth opened fire. Dr. Tanaka watched from her underground bunker as her creations reached up into the sky, beams of superheated plasma burning through the atmosphere. To strike at the invader's tears streamed down her face as she saw a Dominion landing craft explode, transformed into fireballs that streaked across the sky like falling stars. "For my father," she whispered, remembering the old man who had told her to never stop dreaming. "For everyone who believed in me when no one else did." The Valorians tried to adapt, regrouping their forces and targeting the plasma. Installations with orbital bombardment cities burned as alien weapons struck the surface, and millions of people died in the first hour of the battle. But for every cannon they destroyed, 3 more opened fire from hidden locations. Humanity had known they could not protect everything, so they had built their weapons in secret, scattered across the globe in places the Dominion would never think to look. A plasma cannon hidden in the basement of a hospital in Berlin, missile batteries buried beneath farmland in Argentina, railguns mounted on cargo ships disguised as fishing vessels. And then came the volunteers. 50 cargo ships, crewed by men and women who had kissed their families goodbye, knowing they would never return, accelerated toward the Dominion fleet. They carried no weapons, only their engines and their hulls, and their absolute determination to make their deaths mean something. The Valorians tried to shoot them down, but there were too many coming from too many directions. The first cargo ship struck a Dominion destroyer at full speed, and both vessels ceased to exist in a flash of fire and metal. Then another ship hit, and another, and another. Captain Jorge Mendez of the cargo ship, Last Sunset, guided his vessel toward the largest cruiser he could find. His crew of 12 stood with him on the bridge, holding hands and singing an old song from their homeland as the enemy ship filled their view screen. "We are not afraid," Jorge said into the radio so that everyone on Earth could hear. "We are not alone. Humanity forever." The impact destroyed the cruiser's engine section and sent the vessel spinning out of control into 2 other ships on the ground. Soldiers fought in the ruins of cities that had stood for centuries. The old British sergeant major led his unit through the burning streets of London, engaging Valorian ground troops in close combat that the aliens had never expected. Dominion soldiers were larger and stronger and better equipped, but they had never fought an enemy like this. Humans who refused to retreat even when wounded. Humans who used every piece of rubble as a weapon. Humans who screamed defiance with their dying breaths and took enemies with them into death. A young private named Sarah tackled a Valorian soldier 3 times her size, jamming a knife into the gap in his armor while he tried to throw her off. She died with her hands around his throat, and her sergeant major honored her by killing 4 more enemies before the sun set. Admiral Okonkwo watched the battle unfold on her screens, her face a mask of controlled fury. They were losing. She knew they were always going to lose this battle, but they were making the Dominion bleed for every inch of ground. And that had never happened before. When the sun rose on day 31, the Dominion had lost 60 ships and thousands of soldiers. Grand Emissary Vethkon stood in silence on his damaged bridge, staring at the casualty reports with something that felt dangerously close to fear. This was not supposed to happen. Primitive species did not destroy Dominion warships. Primitive species did not fight with such savage determination. Primitive species did not smile as they died, as if death itself was just another weapon in their arsenal. Grand Emissary Dexal said quietly, "We should withdraw and regroup. Our fleet has taken significant damage, and our ground forces are being overwhelmed by resistance fighters in every theater." Vethkon wanted to refuse, wanted to crush this insignificant planet and everyone on it, but he was old and experienced, and he knew when a battle had turned against him. "Signal the retreat," he said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "We will return with a proper armada, and then we will burn this world to ash." The Dominion fleet pulled back beyond the moon, and humanity stood in the ruins of their cities and looked up at the sky. They had not won, they had only survived the first round. But a first round. Survival was something. And it gave them time to prepare for what was coming next. Admiral Okonkwo broadcast a message to the entire planet that night. Today we proved that we can hurt them. Tomorrow we will prove that we can beat them. Rest now, because the real war has just begun. In bunkers and shelters across the globe. Humanity listened to her words and felt something that had been missing since the aliens first appeared. They felt hope, and hope, as the Dominion was about to learn, was the most dangerous weapon humanity possessed. Earth was given an ultimatum. Humanity answered with fire. The Dominion High Council met in their great chamber on the throne world of Valoria Prime. And for the first time in 800 years, they gathered to discuss defeat. Grand Emissary Vethkon knelt before the Council of Seven. His pride shattered and his reputation in ruins. You were given 200 ships to pacify a primitive world, spoke the eldest. A massive Valorian whose carapace had turned white with age. And you lost 60 to creatures who had never left their own moon. Explain this failure. Vethkon raised his head, his 4 eyes burning with shame and fury. The humans are unlike any species we have encountered. They do not fight like rational beings, and they do not value their own lives. They throw themselves into death as if it means nothing. And they use weapons so crude and brutal that our systems cannot anticipate them. The council murmured among themselves, their clicking mandibles creating a sound like distant thunder. We have heard enough excuses, declared the war minister. Rising from his seat, the Dominion will assemble a proper armada. 2,000 ships, including 3 planet crackers. We will not offer surrender this time. We will simply erase this species from existence. Vethkon bowed his head in acceptance. But deep inside he felt something he had never felt before. He felt doubt on Earth. Humanity used the time they had bought with blood to prepare for round 2. Engineers worked on wreckage from the first battle, tearing apart Dominion technology to understand its secrets in a secure facility in Australia. A team of hackers led by a young woman named Maya Singh worked on a captured data core from a crashed Valorian fighter. They had been trying to crack the encryption for 11 days straight, sleeping in shifts and consuming more coffee than water on the 12th day. Maya let out a scream that made her entire team jump. "I am in," she shouted, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "Oh my God. I am in, and you need to see this." What they found changed everything. The Dominion was not a union of willing members. It was an empire of slaves. Over 100 species lived under Valorian rule, forced to work in mines and factories and farms to feed the Dominion war machine. The Kreth, a race of powerful warriors, had been defeated 500 years ago and now served as forced laborers on manufacturing worlds. The Silith, beings of living crystal, were enslaved on mining colonies where their bodies were harvested for components. The Yathi, the Dren, the Morkai, and dozens of others, all conquered and broken and waiting for someone to show them that resistance was possible. Admiral Okonkwo read the intelligence reports with her senior staff, and a plan began to form in her Minda plan, so bold and so crazy that it made the first battle look like a warm-up exercise. "We cannot beat them by defending Earth," she told her commanders. "They are coming with 2,000 ships and weapons that can crack our planet open like an egg. Our only hope is to make them fight on multiple fronts." She pulled up a star map showing Dominion supply lines and the locations of major slave colonies. "We need to bring the war to them. We need to show every conquered species in this galaxy that the Dominion can be hurt. And we need to start a fire that they cannot contain." In the weeks that followed, human engineers performed miracles. They reverse-engineered Dominion FDL technology from crashed ships, building crude but functional jump drives that could carry small vessels across the stars. The drives burned out after a single use and killed their operators half the time. But there was no shortage of volunteers teams, of special forces soldiers trained for missions they knew would be one-way trips. They would jump into Dominion space, strike at supply depots and communication relays, and broadcast a message to every enslaved world. The message was simple: they can bleed. And we have proven it. Rise with us. The Dominion Armada arrived at Earth 60 days after the first battle, and the sight of it made humanity's blood run cold. 2,000 ships darkened the sky, and 3 massive vessels larger than cities moved into position above the planet. These were planet crackers, weapons capable of boring into a world's core and triggering an extinction level. Eruption Grand Emissary Vethkan watched from his new flagship with cold satisfaction. "Begin the bombardment," he ordered. "Leave nothing alive." The first planet cracker began charging its primary weapon, a beam of energy that would drill through the Earth's crust in seconds. Cities evacuated in panic as humanity realized that this was the end. All their weapons, all their courage, all their defiance would mean nothing against this kind of power. And then the messages started coming in across Dominion space. Chaos erupted simultaneously. The Krathon Manufactorum 9 had received the human transmission 3 days earlier, and it had spread through the slave population like fire when the human strike team hit the orbital defense station. The Kreth workers rose up and overwhelmed their Valorian overseers with nothing but their bare hands and stolen tools on 17 mining colonies. The Silith used their knowledge of the tunnel systems to trap and destroy Dominion security forces. The Yathi hijacked communication relays and broadcast the human message to 100 more worlds. They can bleed. Rise with us. Species that had lived in submission for centuries remembered what it felt like to fight. Back Grand Emissary Vethkan received the reports on his bridge and felt his world crumbling around him. Impossible, he whispered as icons turned red across his tactical display. This cannot be happening. The War Minister contacted him from Valoria, prime with panic in his voice. The core systems are under threat from internal rebellions. You must return immediately with the fleet to restore order. Vethkan looked at the planet crackers still charging their weapons. So close to finally destroying the humans who had started this nightmare. We have them, he argued. Give me 1 more hour and Earth will be dust. You have your orders, the War Minister snapped. Return now or face execution for disobedience. The Grand Emissary stood on his bridge for a long moment, staring at the blue and green world that had cost him everything. Then he gave the order that would save humanity. All ships, disengage and prepare for jump to the core systems. We are leaving. The Dominion fleet vanished from Earth's sky, leaving behind a planet burning but alive. Admiral Okonkwo watched them go with tears streaming down her face. They had gambled everything on a plan that required 100 things to go right. And somehow it had worked. Strike teams that had made it to Dominion space had lit the spark. The enslaved species had provided this fuel, and the fire was now burning across the galaxy. Communication came through from Maya Singh, who had been coordinating with resistance movements from her bunker. Admiral, we are receiving transmissions from 47 worlds. The rebellions are spreading faster than anyone anticipated. The Dominion is falling apart. Okonkwo allowed herself a smile, thinking of all the people who had died to make this moment possible. Captain Mendez and his crew on the last sunset, Private Sarah, and her knife in the streets of London. Strike team volunteers who had known they would never come home. Send a message to every world we can reach, she said softly. Tell them that Earth still stands. Tell them that humanity keeps its promises. And tell them that the fire is just getting started in the darkness of space. Rebellions spread from star to star. Humanity had not just survived, they had changed the galaxy forever. Earth was given an ultimatum. Humanity answered with fire. 1. 1 year had passed since the Dominion fleet retreated from Earth, and the galaxy was a very different place. The empire that had ruled 3,000 worlds for 10,000 years was crumbling from within, torn apart by rebellions that spread like wildfire across every sector species that had been enemies under Valorian rule now fought side by side, united by a common hatred of their former masters and inspired by the impossible stand of a small blue planet. Admiral Miriam Okonkwo stood in a conference room that had been hastily constructed in the ruins of Geneva, looking at faces that would have been unimaginable just 12 months ago. The Kreth ambassador, a massive creature with skin like stone and eyes that burned with fierce intelligence, sat across from a Silith representative whose crystalline body caught the light and scattered rainbows across the walls. Delegates from 27 liberated species filled the room. Along with human leaders from every nation that still existed, they had gathered to form something new. Something that had never existed in Galactic history, a council of free worlds. "We are here to discuss the future," Okonkwo said, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had survived. "But first we must address the past." She gestured to a screen that showed a single image. Grand Emissary Vethkon, bound in chains and stripped of his ceremonial armor, stood in a holding cell aboard a Kreth warship. Being who had delivered humanity's death sentence now awaited judgment from the very species he had tried to exterminate. The former Grand Emissary has been captured by Kreth liberation forces, Okonkwo continued, and the question of what to do with him falls to this council. The Kreth ambassador spoke first, his deep voice rumbling like distant earthquakes. "My people spent 500 years under Valorian chains. We say execute him and let his death be a message to all who would enslave others." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room from other species who had suffered under Dominion rule, but a human voice rose above them. Noise. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who had been invited to the council as a representative of the scientific community that had helped save Earth, stood from her seat. "If we execute him, we become no better than the Dominion. We show the galaxy that we traded one set of tyrants for another. Is that the future we fought for?" The room fell silent as her words sank in. Okonkwo watched her people and her new allies wrestle with the question, seeing the conflict in their eyes: mercy versus justice, principle versus revenge. "We will vote on the matter," she announced. "But first, I believe we should hear from the prisoner himself." Guards brought Vethkon into the chamber, and the alien who had once commanded fleets and decided the fates of worlds now shuffled forward in chains. His 4 eyes moved across the room, taking in the faces of those he had considered inferior when he spoke. His translator rendered his words in a voice drained of all arrogance. "You have won," he said simply, "and I expected you to be here celebrating my death. I am curious why you hesitate." Okonkwo stepped forward until she stood directly before him. "Because we are not you. You looked at humanity and saw only violence and chaos and destruction. You thought our history of warfare made us monsters. But you missed something important." She leaned closer, her eyes locked on his. "We have always been capable of terrible things, and our history is indeed filled with darkness. But we have also always been capable of choosing something better. We fight wars, yes, but we also end them. We destroy, but we also rebuild. We are violent, but we are also merciful." Vethkon stared at her for a long moment, genuine confusion in his alien features. "I do not understand your species. You had every reason to want me dead, and yet you argue for my life. Why?" Okonkwo smiled, and there was no cruelty in it, because spite only gets you so far. We fought you out of defiance, out of rage, out of pure stubborn refusal to die. But we did not fight just to survive. We fought so that we could build something better than what came before. If we execute you in anger, We plant seeds of revenge that will grow into future wars. But if we show mercy, we plant seeds of peace. The council voted, and by a narrow margin. Grand Emissary Vethkan was sentenced to exile rather than execution. He would spend the rest of his life on a remote world. Witnessing the galaxy, his empire had terrorized to learn to live in freedom. Some called the decision weak. But history would remember it as one of humanity's finest moments. The Council of Free Worlds spent the following weeks establishing agreements and alliances that would have seemed like fantasy. Just a year earlier, trade routes opened between liberated systems and Earth, bringing technology and resources that would help rebuild what the war had destroyed. Human engineers worked alongside Silith scientists to develop new forms of clean energy. Krith warriors trained human soldiers in combat techniques that had been perfected over millennia, and slowly, carefully, a new galactic order began to take shape on the final day of the Council's first session. The Kreth ambassador approached Admiral Okonkwo with a question that had been bothering him since they first met. "Admiral, I have studied your species extensively since our alliance began. Your history, your culture, your wars and achievements, and I still do not fully understand how you did what you did. How did you find the courage to stand against the Dominion when every calculation said you should lose?" Okonkwo thought about the question for a long moment, thinking of all the people who had sacrificed everything. She thought of Captain Mendez singing as his ship hurtled toward its target. She thought of Dr. Tanaka working through the night on weapons that seemed impossible. She thought of her daughter, who had survived the war and was now studying to become an engineer. "You want to know our secret?" she finally asked. The Kreth ambassador nodded, his stone-like face somehow conveying intense curiosity. "There is no secret," Okonkwo replied. "We are just too stubborn to know when we are beaten. Your Dominion gave us a choice between death and submission, but you forgot that humans do not accept the choices others give us. We make our own choices, even when they seem impossible. You called us violent and chaotic and dangerous. And you were right about all of those things. But you did not understand what those qualities meant." She looked out the window at the stars that humanity was only beginning to explore. "We have spent our entire history fighting. And that means we have spent our entire history refusing to give up. Every war we survived. Every plague we outlasted. Every disaster we rebuilt from. All of it taught us one simple truth." She turned back to the ambassador with fire still burning in her eyes. "You cannot defeat a species that does not know how to quit. You can hurt us. You can burn our cities and kill millions of us. But there will always be survivors. And those survivors will always come back stronger. That is what it means to be human." The Kreth ambassador bowed his massive head in respect. "Then the galaxy is fortunate that you chose to use that strength for liberation rather than conquest." Okonkwo laughed softly. "Do not give us too much credit. We are still violent and chaotic and dangerous. We will make mistakes, and we will sometimes choose wrong. But we will also keep trying to be better. That is the other thing you should know about humans. We never stop reaching for something greater than ourselves." Years later, when historians wrote about the war that changed the galaxy, they struggled to explain how a single primitive planet had brought down an empire. They analyzed the battles and the tactics and the technology. They studied the alliances and the rebellions and the political maneuvering, but in the end, they always came back to the same conclusion: humanity had won because they simply refused to lose. They had taken an ultimatum that should have meant their extinction and turned it into the spark of galactic liberation. And when future generations asked how such a thing was possible, the answer was always the same. The universe gave humanity a choice between fire and oblivion, and humanity chose to become the fire itself. The Dominion had expected submission or Extinction. What they got instead was a species that grabbed their ultimatum in both hands and threw it back in their faces. They got 8 billion people who looked at impossible odds and said, "We can take them." They got stubborn, chaotic, violent, beautiful, defiant humanity, and the galaxy would never be the same again. This was the story that would be told on 1,000 worlds for 1,000 years. The story of how Earth was given an ultimatum and how humanity answered with fire.